So the Commerce Clause, states this, that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And that sounds very broad, and it is. It's very, very broadly interpreted. And we'll talk about some of those interpretations maybe as we go through. So certainly it can regulate foreign commerce, right, and interstate commerce, that commerce that exists between the states. Believe it or not, when the nation was forming, before the Constitution, states had a devil of a time. They were like nation states, and they didn't necessarily trade equally or fairly, and they imposed lots of tariffs and different things like that. And the Constitution kind of, in setting up the Commerce Clause, allowed the federal government to regulate that and make it work better, which it did. The Commerce Clause also limits state police power, and police power here does not mean cops and robbers. It means the ability for states to pass laws that will enhance the general welfare of their populace. And it also limits state taxation, which we'll talk about. So police power, get ahead of myself. State legislation and regulation to protect the public's health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Now, states have broad authority to do that. Don't get me wrong. When we say we limit it, it's just it limits some of the more egregious things that states might do. That would be kind of crazy. Maybe banning soda. I don't know. Maybe that would be okay. But some of things like that, and that may be a poor example, but the federal government may look at askance and say, yeah, maybe that's going a little too far. Federal government has exclusive right to regulate foreign commerce, so we see that, trade deals and those types of things. That's not to say the states can't go over and try to, and in fact I saw Idaho, I think, just signed a deal with Taiwan for grain delivery, and it includes Montana. And that's okay, but it has to fall within the federal regulations, right? The state can regulate commerce if it occurs entirely within state boundaries. And, based on some of the interpretations, it's almost impossible to find examples of that. Maybe the little lemonade stand, on the corner of 3rd and 7th might fit, but maybe farmers markets and whatnot, but even then, maybe not. Believe it or not, it's the Commerce Clause is interpreted that broadly. And an example of that, and you can click on this if you're looking. If you're playing at home, you can click on that Wickard Filburn. Wickard, I believe, is the farmer, but I might have the names backwards. That I believe it was in Ohio, and raised some grain, but the grain, this was back in it might have been during the dirty 30s, but the grain was going to be entirely used for their own family consumption and or to feed some of the critters on the farm, and so it was not going to enter into the public supply or the public commodity arena. And the federal government, probably through the USDA, because they had all kinds of limitations going on back then, wanted to regulate how much grain or whatever that Wickard could grow or whatnot, and he sued and lost. And the federal government said that no matter how, the Supreme Court said, no matter how minute that grain is that you're growing or portion, it still can have some impact on commodity prices, and therefore can be regulated by the federal government. So interstate commerce can include persons that are engaged in activities that are affecting interstate commerce. Again, it restricts state police power, and that sounds daunting, but the truth, again, is that states have broad authority to pass laws that affect the general welfare of their people. They just can't get crazy, can't do things that are outside the bounds of our Constitution. It also says that the federal government shall have exclusive regulatory authority over things like airports, foreign trade. And again, it's becoming harder to find examples of things that are truly interstate. Dual regulation is fairly common, where you've got federal preemption and dual regulation doesn't apply here, but you do have some cases where there's no federal regulation. But dual regulation is fairly common, and by that, I mean this: our state, for example, has a Department of Environmental Quality. Well, it does many of the same things that the Environmental Protection Agency does. Okay, and so we create dual regulations, and that's okay. For example, California is widely regarded to have, environmental regulations and whatnot, rules and regulations that go well beyond what the federal government's is, and that's okay. It kind of gets to the broad powers that states have for state police powers, and they haven't been restricted. But if you tried to pass laws that said our laws are less restrictive, that probably wouldn't fly. In fact, Montana had one of those with gun law, I think, and that had to do with interstate commerce. Montana passed a law. They did pass it, actually, at our state legislature, and I think the government, signed it. It's been several years ago, but it said that if a gun is manufactured in Montana, sold in Montana, and stays in Montana, it's not subject to any federal regulations. And if I'm not mistaken, the courts struck that down. Even the Montana courts struck that down. So, state taxation can be a form of regulation, right? Think of tobacco taxes or alcohol taxes, right? Even gasoline taxes and those types of things. It's limited by the Commerce Clause. Maybe the way to say that is that I can't tax cigarettes that are sold in the state of Washington. Okay. Especially to Washington residents. There might be some provisions that I could tax it on a sales tax basis if the person was a resident of Montana and went to Washington to avoid the tax, But then apportionment is just a method that allows big companies, think of Walmart. How do they determine, without some pretty dastardly accounting, how do they determine how much they owe each state or what kind of profit they made in each state? So they're allowed to apportion it, maybe based on the outlets that they have there, the percentage of sales, those types of things. How they're all calculated, I'm not sure. I'm guessing it gets into some complications. So there must be a sufficient tie or a nexus or a tax situs. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but saying that in order for us to have like income taxes, again, is it okay to pass an income tax on the BNSF that does some business in the state of Montana? It's headquartered out of Fort Worth, Texas. Yeah. If BN's, transporting Montana wheat and doing things like that, we have a right to, as a state, to recover some of the revenue, and so BN needs to show, what they make or lose in the state of Montana in order to determine what they ought to pay in taxes. And that would be the same for other big corporations as well. It's also the case for, personal property and those types of things. And by personal property, what about vehicles? Well, I'll give you my own personal example. So my wife and I went to, my sister-in-law works at a car dealership, and we were in need of a vehicle. And while I might have preferred to stay local, I had the family thing to worry about. So we purchased a vehicle through my sister-in-law's dealership in Washington. Washington's got a very high sales tax, okay? But they can't impose that upon us, right? Because we're from Montana. And so there's not a nexus or a tie in that case, because I'm not benefiting, and the courts have ruled this, I'm not benefiting from the things that I would pay taxes for in the state of Washington. I don't necessarily have to pay those taxes. Okay? Big ticket items, that's fairly common. Small ticket items, you go to the grocery store and buy a 6-pack of beer, you probably don't argue about the taxes. Well, you perhaps could. Do the protections of the Bill of Rights apply to businesses? Say, yeah, for the most part they do. Citizens United, if you want to look up a case, that's a good example. So we're getting into the amendments and the basic protections, so we'll start that with part 3 coming up.